When I was 4 years old, people discovered that I was both deaf and mute. My name is Lydia Chu. I didn't know it then, of course. Back then I was just the deaf-mute girl of the Chu family. My grandmother, Grandma Agnes Chu, took me up the mountain one day. She tied me tightly to the trunk of a tree and muttered under her breath, "Born deaf and dumb, no one will ever want a thing like this, better to leave her here, then we can still have a grandson." My mother, Hannah Zhao, had been a woman who spent her whole life bowing her head and enduring. That day, she suddenly turned into someone else. She lunged forward like a wild animal, tore me from their hands. Blood and tears were smeared across her face. At the door, Grandma Agnes stood shivering in the cold, her voice as sour as vinegar. "A hen that can't lay eggs gets thrown out sooner or later. Once they're divorced, our David Chu can still marry a clean, proper girl." A few years later, that same grandmother would be on her knees, clinging to my mother's legs and begging. "After all, you and David were husband and wife, you shared a life. Lydia is Chu blood. How can you be so heartless and abandon her father, abandon this mother-in-law too?" My parents hadn't been married long when I came along. My aunt by marriage, Aunt Linda Chu, sighed and said, "So young and already paying for sins. This child won't see a single easy day in her life." When my mother, Hannah, married into the Chu family, times were hard. Every sack of grain they had to be saved for the baby in her belly, me. Grandpa Samuel Chu had already prepared the firecrackers. Grandma Agnes even spent money on 2 whole gin of pork belly, something they couldn't even bear to eat during New Year's. Nobody expected that on that good day, with a good bride ready, the groom would disappear. The one who showed up to take the bride wasn't the groom written in the marriage contract. It was my father, David Chu. After leaving the army, David worked as a security guard at the county jute factory. He'd once been the kind of man all the village girls secretly admired. Grandpa Samuel saw that his son liked someone else's bride, Emily Wang, and egged him on to wreck the wedding. My father had a bold, reckless temper. Whatever he liked, he had to have. That day he drank a lot of liquor and, in the end, simply claimed he was the groom. Just like that, a joyful wedding turned into a farce. The original groom, Victor Wang, no matter how thick-skinned he was, couldn't swallow something that absurd. At that time my father didn't have a horse, only an old bicycle. He pedaled all the way to the Wang family's village. When news from the groom's side reached Emily's parents, Mr. and Mrs. Wang, they almost fainted. Changing the groom now was no different from smearing mud on the entire clan's face. The Chu family wasn't poor. David worked in a state unit, even if he was just a guard, people still called that a cadre. If their daughter Emily married into that family, it would be easier for her to get a better job later on. The two families argued back and forth all evening. David started making oaths, swearing up and down that he would marry Hannah, the substitute bride his family had chosen. It was past midnight when they finally reached a temporary compromise. The truth was, my mother Hannah wasn't ugly. She was just worse in every way compared to Emily. Both girls were daughters. But Emily Wang was pretty and fair, had finished high school and gone to work in town, earning more than 70 yuan a month. Hannah was small and dark, terrible at studying, and had quit school after junior high to work the fields at home. Even the bride price for Hannah was lower than for Emily. Emily's family shook with rage. A big piece of fat meat had flown right out of their mouths. Under the pressure of gossip, Mr. and Mrs. Wang reluctantly agreed to David's swap the groom proposal. Emily was from a decent family. She had no face left to stay in that village. She moved with her parents to the city. Aunt Linda said that though their life later wasn't bad, people in the village always sniped that their wages in town were only 50 or 60 yuan a month, fixed salary, and on top of that the boss kept tight hold of the money. Compared to people who bought houses and traded goods in the city, that kind of income was nothing. Emily's parents had thought that marrying into a city household would bring an easy life. They never expected that just a few years later they'd be back in the village, farming again. Back then Grandma Agnes never imagined there would be a day she'd have to pay for what she'd done, never wondered whether she was stepping on a knife's edge or into burning coals. She only thought about the benefit right in front of her. My mother Hannah became a stand-in for Emily. That marriage started off crooked, and anyone could see the tragic ending coming from far away. Grandma Agnes told this story over and over to the neighbors, bragging that Hannah was a daughter-in-law, handed over to the Chu family by the Wangs. If it wasn't for that girl putting on a show about killing herself, Agnes would say, we never would have taken her. Before this mess, my mother Hannah had been promised to the son of the Wang family in our village, Victor Wang. They were one of the few proper, hard-working families. The Wangs had 3 tiled houses, and a few years earlier they'd even built a flat-roofed brick house. Back then, if you had a flat-roofed house, you were considered one of the rich households in the village. In the neighbors' eyes, marrying a daughter into a family like that was something to show off about. Aunt Linda said that on the day Grandma Agnes reluctantly agreed to let David go, steal a bride, she strictly forbade anyone mentioning the engagement with the Wangs. The Wang boy listens to his parents. He'll stop pestering us. He's not good enough for my son anyway. The whole village knows that boy's been sick since he was in the womb. He won't live long. So Agnes watched with her own eyes as Grandpa Samuel took David off to get married. On the bike they carried a wooden invitation board. The name carved on it was David Chu, second son of the Chu family. The night before the wedding, the whole village already knew about it. People crowded into the yard gossiping, the Wang girl Emily is blessed. It's such a long way and they still ride all the way themselves to fetch the bride. Folks in the neighboring commune will have to save for years to afford a wedding like that. Only 3 families in the village had bicycles, the Wangs, the Chus, and the Lees. That alone showed how much the Wangs were spending to marry off their daughter. Agnes sighed and complained to the neighbors, if my eldest son can't get a wife but this sickly second son marries the Wang girl, that's like making money out of thin air. She said that, but in the ears of relatives who didn't know the truth, the Chu family just looked lucky. Even my mother Hannah thought she was blessed, with a baby already growing inside her. Hannah had a gentle, yielding nature, but she also had a buried streak of cruelty toward herself. A tiny 17-year-old girl, and on her wedding day she took a slap across the face from life that she would feel for the rest of her days. Later Aunt Linda would say that if it hadn't been for the pregnancy, they definitely would have forced Hannah to abort. Back then Agnes didn't want a granddaughter. She thought her son had snatched a good bride, and it turned out the woman he brought home was a cast-off wife another man no longer wanted. But the whole thing had been wrong from the start, so even when Hannah married into the Chu family she didn't get a shred of dignity. Years later, Aunt Linda would often see her sitting in a corner, weaving baskets and crying. My father David, blinded by passion, had done that outrageous thing, but in a way it was still a form of love. At first he treated my mother very well, swearing he'd never abandon her and promising to compensate her family. Grandma Agnes doused him in cold water. Let me tell you, fate has already turned its back on you. If you hurt that girl, I'll make you pay for it. Yes, I wouldn't dare, David answered. The truth is, my father wasn't a bad man. The day after the fiasco, he blamed everything on getting drunk because of Hannah, and went to her parents' house to apologize. Grandma Rose Lynn and Grandpa Peter Lynn nearly collapsed seeing their daughter's situation. Whatever happened, we're already husband and wife, David said. He begged them to let Hannah live a decent life. She's already married out. You can't mistreat your own daughter. My father couldn't stand the villagers' mockery, so he only dared knock on my grandparents' door in the middle of the night. That was the night the first cold wind of the season came down. No one knows what they argued about, only that my mother cried herself unconscious and had to be put on and for all night. Aunt Linda said her own mother shook with fury when she saw that. Just wait and see, she said. Who knows how much misery our girl will suffer. The Chu family paid a price too. My father and Grandpa Samuel fought for months. The sound of things breaking and people shouting echoed constantly in the courtyard. Once, Aunt Linda said she saw Samuel lift a wooden pestle and smash it down on the table. David snatched up a stool and hurled it back. The chopping knife slammed into furniture with a sound that jolted the whole yard. The scene was so terrifying that no one in the village dared come too close. My mother Hannah stood in the corner of the room, clutching her belly, hands over her head. There was a long gash down her face and arm. She trembled, terrified to the point of wetting herself. After that, my mother never again spoke of the past. Aunt Linda said that if it hadn't been for the baby in her belly, my mother might have died that day. Back then, divorce was deeply shameful. In the countryside, if a woman divorced, people automatically assumed there was something wrong with her, either she couldn't keep a husband or she was loose. Grandma Agnes would rather be a widow than bear the stain of divorce. The issue suddenly became a village-wide spectacle. People crowded into the yard, the noise of their chatter thick as smoke, everyone offering advice and persuasion. Some soft-hearted women said, "She's already given you a grandson and she's still in confinement. How can you bear to throw her out?" Men just like novelty. But at the end of the day, what they need at home is a wife who sweeps the floor, cooks, washes clothes, spreads manure. If she doesn't work like an ox and a horse, who will do it for you? My father just bowed his head in silence. My mother sat on the bed holding me, not kneeling to anyone, not pleading, saying nothing at all. A woman who refuses to fight other women for a man is a woman with dignity. My mother Hannah was that kind of woman. After talking with David, the village secretary Mr. Carter stepped in to mediate. He said my mother's mind was in a bad state and she was still in confinement. No matter what, it wasn't right to drive her out now. If David insisted on a divorce, they'd have to wait until later. In the end, only one name was signed on the divorce papers, David Chu. My father was torn up inside. He said to my mother, "Think whatever you want about me. I'm sorry. I don't want to divorce you. I just want to run away from my mother Agnes. I can't stand it anymore. I want to leave this place. I want to go somewhere she doesn't exist." At that moment, Victor Wang, the man who should have married my mother, had also come to take Hannah home. He stood outside the yard, cursing non-stop. My father and Victor fought from the village gate all the way to our house. In other people's eyes, Victor was the victim. But in my mother's eyes, my father David was the one who had committed the worst sin. He refused to face the problem. All he knew was the most cowardly way, escape. My father was covered in blood, but no one pitied him. Grandpa Samuel stood in the doorway, helpless to stop them, shouting, "Stop! Stop! If someone dies, they'll charge our family with murder." My mother Hannah was treated as a criminal by my father's family, and as a disgrace by her own family. David wanted to run, but in the end, life wouldn't let him. He couldn't leave, because my mother couldn't carry all that humiliation alone. Once the divorce case was pushed up to the commune committee, cadres came to talk to them for days on end. Some said, "A good woman doesn't divorce, a good man doesn't abandon his wife. If you divorce now, how will you show your face to the neighbors later?" In the end, my father never signed the official divorce papers. They wrote them, but never handed them in. The document was shoved into a drawer and lay there for years, like a wound that never fully healed. Then I was born, and things got even more complicated. At first, everyone thought that after giving birth, my mother Hannah's status would improve. After all, the baby was a grandson, the hope of continuing the line. But when they realized I was deaf and mute, every bit of hope went out like a candle in the wind. Grandma Agnes said, "Heaven has decided it. You gave birth to a cripple, don't expect me to treat you as a daughter-in-law anymore." My mother just bit her lip and said nothing back. My father David looked at me with a mixture of love and fear in his eyes. He loved me because I was his child. He feared me because I was a living reminder of every mistake he'd ever made. A child who couldn't hear or speak, in a family already torn apart by conflict, was like a burning coal thrown into dry straw. People whispered that God was punishing the Chu family. Some said David had stolen another man's wife, so his daughter ended up like this. Others said Agnes's venomous tongue and constant meddling in other people's business had brought down retribution. No one dared say it to their faces, but behind their backs the gossip never stopped. My mother Hannah held me in her arms, and the more she heard, the more she felt like a heavy rock hung from a thin string. One more ounce of weight and she would plunge into an abyss. My father couldn't take the pressure. He started leaving for work later and coming home less. Sometimes he slept at the factory, using overtime as an excuse. Whenever he came home and saw me sitting silently in a corner, he drank. He drank till his face turned red and purple, mumbling things no one could understand. My mother cleared away the bowls and chopsticks, answering him with silence. In that house, the only loud noises were arguments and curses. Laughter had long since disappeared. I couldn't hear, but I could see the twisted expressions on people's faces. When Grandma Agnes opened her mouth, her thin sharp lips were like a blade slicing into others' flesh. When David lost his temper, his eyes went bloodshot and his hands shook with rage. When Hannah cried, her shoulders shook, but she held herself back from making a sound. I lived in a world without sound, but I saw clearly everything others pretended not to see. One time, when I was around 4, Agnes suddenly decided to take me up the mountain again. She told everyone she was taking her granddaughter out to play, but Hannah sensed something wrong in her face. My mother wanted to go along, but Agnes blocked her. "Stay home and rest. I'll take Lydia up there to burn incense to the ancestors, so she'll grow stronger." Hannah hesitated, but in the end she stayed. She had just finished confinement and her body was still weak. Grandma Agnes took my hand and we walked up the dirt trail climbing the hillside. The rocky path was uneven, weeds growing thick on both sides. I was unsteady on my feet and nearly fell several times, but she only yanked my hand and never turned back to help. When we reached a quiet spot, she stopped. In front of us stood a big tree, its roots rising above the ground like giant snakes. She took the rope she'd brought and tied me tightly to the trunk. I didn't understand what was happening. I only knew I struggled and twisted, but she tied me securely. When she was finished, she stepped back and looked at me for a long time. There wasn't a trace of softness in her eyes, only cold and irritation. She muttered, "Born deaf and dumb. No one will take a thing like you. Better to leave you. Then we can still have a grandson." Then she turned and walked away, leaving me alone on the mountain. The wind blew, leaves rustled, clouds gathered. I couldn't hear any of it, but I felt the air turn colder. My hands and feet shook, I didn't know whether from cold or fear. I wanted to call for my mother Hannah, but my mouth only opened and closed soundlessly. Tears streamed down my cheeks, soaking into my collar. Time passed. The sun slowly sank behind the gray clouds. Darkness crawled over everything. There were no lights on the mountain, only a few fireflies flickering in the grass. I couldn't hear insects chirping, but I saw tiny shadows moving in the undergrowth. Now and then something brushed my leg and I flinched in terror. I don't know how long I cried. By the time my head was spinning and my eyes could barely stay open, a figure rushed toward me. It was my mother, Hannah. She was panting, hair disheveled, face deathly pale. When she saw me tied to the tree, she almost collapsed. She fell to her knees, hands shaking as she untied the rope, crying as she worked. I fell into her arms, my whole body ice cold. Hannah held me so tightly it was as if she thought I would disappear if she loosened her grip. She carried me down the mountain, stumbling as she ran. On the way, she met a few villagers who were out cutting firewood. They were horrified by the sight and hurried over to ask what had happened. My mother could only cry, unable to form words. When we got home, my body was already blue and stiff with cold. Grandma Rose Lynn snatched me up and hurried inside, lighting a fire to warm me. My mother stood in the yard, eyes red. Grandma Agnes sat inside, expression flat, as if none of it had anything to do with her. Hannah rushed in and grabbed her by the collar, shouting each word through gritted teeth, "Where did you take Lydia? Tell me where you took her." In an instant, the yard was full of people. Some tried to pull her back. "She's your mother-in-law, how can you grab her like that? She just lost her temper for a moment." But my mother didn't care. She screamed, her voice hoarse from crying, if I hadn't found my child today, if she had died up there, I would have fought you with my life." For the first time, the entire village saw a daughter-in-law daring to aim her fury straight at her mother-in-law. Agnes's face went from pale to crimson with shame and rage as Hannah held her by the collar. Under the neighbors' accusing gazes, she could no longer spit out the venom she usually did. Grandpa Samuel stood nearby, hands shaking around his cigarette, too afraid to take a puff. Aunt Linda hovered by the door, torn between fear and worry. That day, the Chu family courtyard was like a stage, and every person was dragged into their assigned role. From that day on, the conflicts in the house only deepened. Outwardly things quieted down for a while, but the cracks had already become chasms that could never be filled. My mother Hannah took me back to her parents' house and said she never wanted to return to the Chu family again. But in the countryside, once a woman is married off, it's very hard for her to stay long-term in her parents' home. Neighbors would wag their tongues, saying, "That family's daughter doesn't know her place. Married off and still wants to run back to her mother's house." Grandma Rose held my mother, both loving and angry. "Child, a woman's life is hard by nature," she said. "Endure if you can, for yourself, for Lydia. If you come back here for good, what kind of life will she have? She'll bear the label, the daughter of the woman thrown out by her husband, forever." My mother stayed silent for a long time. In the end, she went back to the Chu household. But from then on, she no longer trusted anyone in that family. In her heart, she had only me, Lydia. I was the only thread holding her to this life. In the years that followed, my parents' relationship became strange. They no longer screamed at each other, but they rarely spoke. Some evenings all you could hear were chopsticks clinking, the wind whistling through the cracks in the door, no warm words at all. My father David came home from work, ate, and then went out to smoke alone in the dark yard. My mother Hannah busied herself in the kitchen, washing dishes, tidying up, then came into the room to hold me as I slept. Every time I startled awake at night, she patted my back. I couldn't hear any lullaby, but I could feel the steady rhythm of her hand. When I was 4, they finally took me to the county hospital. The doctor said I had congenital hearing loss. If I didn't wear a hearing aid soon, my chances of recovery were very low. My mother felt as though someone was squeezing her heart. My father David asked, "How much does a hearing aid cost?" The doctor said a number that, for a rural family like ours, was a small fortune. Grandpa Samuel's face went white. Grandma Agnes gave a cold laugh, "Spending that much to save a deaf-mute? Not worth it. Bring her back and have another one." My mother turned to my father, eyes full of pleading. But David bowed his head without a word. He quietly lit a cigarette, the smoke curling up to hide his expression. From that day on, my mother Hannah started going out to work for others. She hired herself out to work the fields, harvesting rice, pulling weeds, spreading fertilizer, any job she could do, she did. Her hands became calloused, her back bent, but she gritted her teeth and endured. Every time she got paid, she tucked the money into a cloth pouch and hid it at the bottom of a chest. It was my mother's private fund, her fund to buy back my hearing. She never told anyone, not even David. Once, my father discovered it and asked, "Where did this money come from?" "From pulling weeds and plowing other people's fields," Hannah answered. David frowned. "Why didn't you give it to me to keep?" My mother just gave a small, cold smile. "I'm keeping it in case something happens later." My father wanted to say more, but when he saw her eyes, he only sighed. Deep down he knew that money was for me. One day, Mr. Carter, the village secretary, came and said that the county had a support program for disabled children. If we had enough paperwork, we could apply for a subsidy toward a hearing aid. Grandma Agnes was delighted, not because I now had a chance to hear, but because there was money to be had. "Good," she said. "Lydia being deaf and mute is a blessing for this family. We'll go to the county and get her a disability certificate. Then we can still have another child." My father's face darkened. He knew that in his mother's eyes, I was nothing but a pretext to grab benefits. But he still didn't dare speak up. My mother said nothing, only carried me into the room. She stroked my hair and whispered, "I'll do my best. Even if I have to work like a beast my whole life, I want you to hear this world." After many months of scraping and saving, my mother finally gathered enough money, together with the small subsidy, to take me to the county for a hearing aid. It was the first time I had ever left our tiny village. On the way, the bus rattled and shook, dust swirling everywhere. Hannah held my hand tightly so I wouldn't fall. I sat by the window, watching the fields slide past, the distant mountains fade into mist. At the county hospital, the doctors re-examined my hearing and suggested a suitable device. When they named the price, my mother almost collapsed. The amount was far more than she'd imagined. The subsidy covered only a small part. The rest we had to pay ourselves. My mother turned her cloth pouch inside out, pulling out crumpled banknotes and counting them again and again. In the end, it still wasn't enough. My father David stood there, face tense. He took a pack of cigarettes from his pocket, stared at it for a long time, and put it back. Then he reached into his trouser pocket and pulled out a handful of wrinkled bills, the money he kept for drinking and smoking. He put it on the counter and murmured, "Here's a bit more." My mother looked up at him, eyes red, but said nothing. She clumsily gathered all the money and handed it to the doctor. When they fitted the hearing aid, I was terrified. The nurse's hands were cold, the device strange and alien behind my ear canal tight and buzzing. I frowned, trying instinctively to tear it off, but my mother held my hand tightly, her eyes gentle. She said, "Don't be afraid, Lydia. In a moment, you'll hear my voice." The first sound I heard clearly was my mother's voice, warm and trembling. "Lydia, can you hear me?" I nodded, tears rolling down my cheeks. From that day on, my world was no longer one of absolute silence. I could hear footsteps, the wind in the trees, the hum of insects, the clatter of bowls, dogs barking, people talking, all of it crashing into my ears at once. At night, those sounds would turn into shadows pressing down on my chest. Sometimes in my sleep, the rustling of leaves mixed with distant bells would become a dark forest. I was lost in it, unable to find a way out. I would see shapes looming around me, feel my lungs squeeze, then jerk awake, gasping. Each time, Hannah would hold me tight and soothe me. Her voice, coming through the hearing aid, sounded as if it came from very far away, but it was endlessly warm. Gradually, I learned to live with sound. At first, everything was chaos, dishes clattering, dogs barking, people talking, leaves rustling, all jumbled together, making my head ache. There were days I wanted to rip the hearing aid off and curl up in a quiet corner. But every time I saw the hope in my mother's eyes, I forced myself to endure. She said, "You have to learn to hear so you can learn to speak later, Lydia." In the village, some people mocked, "If she's deaf and dumb, just let her be. Why waste money?" Others said, "Who knows, maybe she'll learn a word or two. That's better than staying silent forever." Everyone had something to say, but no one understood my mother's heart. She didn't want me to be outstanding. She only wanted me to hear a little, speak a little, so the world wouldn't leave me too far behind. Thanks to the hearing aid, I slowly started imitating sounds. At first, I could only make garbled noises. Grandma Rose heard them and burst into tears. "That's talking," she cried. But my mother Hannah laughed, eyes shining. "My daughter Lydia is calling me," she said. As time went by, I learned to say Mom. The first Mom I uttered was warped and windy, like air blowing through a crack, but Hannah stood frozen. Then she suddenly pulled me into her arms and cried like a child. Life was still hard, but in my mother's heart a small light had been lit, the belief that her daughter Lydia could hear and speak. She kept working everywhere, no matter how hot the sun or how heavy the rain. Her hands split and bled, her back ached constantly, but each time she saw me practicing pronunciation, her tiredness vanished. My father David, too, slowly changed. He started coming home earlier, drinking less. Once, he stood secretly outside the door, watching me practice. When I finally called out, "Dad, my voice still thick and clumsy. He turned away, took a deep breath and quietly wiped his eyes. Even so, the relationship between David and Hannah never returned to what it had been. The old wounds were still there, only covered over. They lived under the same roof, but each had a space inside that the other could no longer reach. I grew up in that atmosphere. When I was 6, Mr. Carter came again. He said the county had a special school for deaf and mute children. If I studied there, I could learn sign language, maybe even how to read and write. My mother's eyes lit up, my father's darkened. He asked, "How much is the tuition?" Mr. Carter said there was some financial aid, but the family still had to pay a monthly fee, a small amount for city people, a big problem for us. My mother didn't hesitate. "As long as Lydia can take care of herself in the future, I can suffer," Hannah said. She started saving every coin. Money from working other people's fields, from collecting scrap to sell, from washing and cleaning for others, she put all of it aside, not daring to waste a single yuan. Many times, on her way home from work, she passed a stall selling steaming buns. She would stop, hands sliding into her pocket. In the end she would turn away and walk faster. "If I eat a bun today, I'll have to work extra hours tomorrow to make up the money," she said. "Better save it for Lydia." On the morning I was to enroll at the county school, my mother woke up early. She washed my clothes, hung them to dry, then folded them neatly into an old cloth bag. She packed a few corn cakes and boiled eggs, to eat on the road. Before we left, she talked to me as if I were already grown. "Lydia, you must listen to your teachers. Don't fight, don't skip class. If you miss home, bear with it. I'll come visit on weekends." I nodded, trying to memorize every word. The bus to the county was packed. My mother held the cloth bag, I held my hearing aid. It was small, but for me it was a bridge to the world. As the bus pulled away, the village slid behind us. Through the window I saw Grandma Agnes standing in the distance, arms on her hips, her expression unreadable. My father David stood beside her, hands stuffed in his pockets, a cigarette unlit in his mouth. He didn't wave, but his eyes followed the bus until it disappeared. At school I met many children like myself. Some couldn't hear anything at all and didn't wear hearing aids. Some could hear a little and spoke with heavy speech impediments. We communicated with our hands and our eyes. At first I was bewildered, lost, not used to being away from home and my mother. The first night, lying on the bunk, I listened to the strange sounds of the dorm through my hearing aid, bedding rustling, steady breathing, someone sobbing softly. I turned over, tears seeping silently into my pillow. But gradually, I adapted. I grew to like classes, to enjoy practicing lip reading and pronunciation. Our teacher, Ms. Allen, was patient, teaching us one sound at a time, one word at a time. Every time I pronounced something correctly, she smiled and nodded encouragement. My mother visited once a month. Each time she came, she brought bags of food from home, boiled eggs, sweet potatoes, corn cakes, roasted peanuts. She worried I wouldn't get used to school food, so she brought my favorites. She asked about my studies and lit up when Ms. Allen praised me, smiling to herself all the way home. Once, on her way back from visiting me, my mother ran into Victor Wang. He was riding a bicycle loaded with wood, probably from the carpentry shop. He stopped and said, "Long time no see. Are you well?" My mother forced a smile. "I'm the same as always," Hannah said. "Just older." He looked at the bag in her hand. "You went to see Lydia?" he asked. She nodded. He was quiet a moment, then said, "The girl looks a lot like you. But her eyes are like David's." My mother lowered her head and said nothing. Those words cut into her heart like a knife. They stood by the road talking about trivial things. He asked about her life, asked whether the Chu family still made things hard for her. She shook her head. "It's all in the past," she said. "Now I only care about my daughter." When they parted, he said, "If you ever need help carrying something heavy, tell me. I have a bike, I can help." My mother nodded and thanked him, but inside she knew a distance had opened up between them that would never close. Of course, the village didn't leave them in peace. The gossiping women said, "Look at them, weren't they once engaged? Still meeting each other, are they? A widowed woman and a single man, they'll get entangled sooner or later." My mother heard it all and could only bite her lip and stay silent. She knew that one careless step and not only she, but I, Lydia, would bear the consequences. Malicious words in the countryside are like thorns in the ground, every few steps you get stabbed again. The older I got, the clearer that truth became. Many times, people thought I couldn't understand and talked about me right in front of me. "That crippled girl, no man will ever want her," they said. "She's the curse the Chu family has to carry." I pretended not to hear and walked away. But every time I came home and saw new wrinkles on Hannah's forehead, I knew she hurt far more than I did. One day in class, Ms. Allen asked us to write about the person we loved most. My classmates wrote about their fathers, mothers, siblings. I picked up my pen and thought for a while, then began to write. I wrote about my mother Hannah, her hair streaked with early gray, her calloused hands, the mix of tenderness and steel in her eyes. I wrote about that dark night on the mountain, when she ran like a madwoman through the cold wind to find me. I wrote about the first time I heard her voice through the hearing aid. My hands shook as I turned in the assignment. Ms. Allen read it and was quiet for a long time. Then she looked up and pulled me into her arms. Through her clothes I heard her heartbeat thudding. "Child," she said, "you must live well. Not just for yourself, but for your great mother too." Time slipped by and I became a young woman. The hearing aid sat behind my ear like part of my body. Every morning, the first thing I did after waking was put it on and let the world pour into my ears. If I forgot it, the sudden silence made me panic. At school I learned many things, not just words, but how to accept being different. Some classmates were jokers who kept everyone laughing. Others were shy, too afraid to raise their heads. I was somewhere in the middle, not outstanding, but not invisible. Once, a girl in our class was mocked by kids from outside because of her hearing aid. They imitated her speech and roared with laughter. She ran to the bathroom, locked herself in and sobbed. Miss Allen found her and gathered the whole class. "There's nothing shameful about needing devices to hear and speak," she said. "People with normal eyes wear glasses to see better. Do they feel ashamed? What matters is how we live, not what our bodies are like." I engraved her words on my heart. Later, whenever I heard someone throw out words like cripple or invalid too easily, I remembered her gaze that day. At home, my mother Hannah grew older. Her back curved, her hair turned white. But whenever she looked at me, she still smiled, a tired smile, but full of pride. "I'm not afraid of hardship," she said. "I'm only afraid you'll suffer, Lydia." Once, she fell in the fields. When the neighbors brought her home, her clothes were smeared with mud and her knees were bleeding. I rushed to help her onto the bed. She waved me off. "I'm fine. Old people fall, that's normal." But I saw her wince with every movement. That night, I lay awake. For the first time, I felt true fear of time. If one day my mother wasn't there, what would become of me? I started to cry quietly. My mother heard and slowly sat up, shuffling to my bed. She sat down, stroked my hair and said, "So big already and still crying, Lydia?" I hugged her and soaked her shoulder in tears. She laughed. "Don't be scared," Hannah said. "I'm not going anywhere yet. I still have to see you get married and have children." I blushed and pushed her away playfully, but warmth spread through my chest. People tried to arrange marriages for me in the village. "There's this man 10 years older than you," the matchmaker said. "Honest and hard-working, just a bit quiet. For a girl like Lydia, if someone's willing to marry her, she should be grateful. She can't be picky." My mother listened without interrupting. Then she asked, "Does he despise my daughter for being deaf and mute?" The go-between forced a smile. "Men in the countryside all want normal wives," she said. But if you give enough dowry, he probably won't mind much. My mother's face hardened. Forget it, she said. Thank you, but our family isn't worthy of such in-laws. The matchmaker stared. Think it over, she said. A disabled girl is hard to marry. If you don't settle now, it'll only get harder. My mother answered, I'd rather leave Lydia unmarried than marry her off to someone who sees her as a burden they're paid to carry. The matchmaker left, muttering, stubborn woman. Soon the whole village knew. They said Hannah didn't know her place, that with a disabled daughter she still dared turn up her nose at a proposal. Some sneered, she must think Lydia is a princess. My mother just smiled and didn't explain. She told me, having a husband isn't everything, Lydia. What matters is meeting the right person. If someone truly loves you, I'll give everything I have. If not, the two of us living together is just fine. I swallowed down my tears. If my mother had been like other women, she might have bowed to pressure and forced me into a marriage just to say I was taken. But she didn't. She stood by my side and faced down the whole village. A few years later, my mother met Michael Liu, a man who worked at a machine shop in the county. He wasn't handsome or powerful. He was soft-spoken, polite, and, most importantly, he respected my mother. They met when she was visiting me in the county. That day it rained and Hannah hadn't brought an umbrella. She stood under the hospital eaves, soaked through. Michael passed by, handed her his umbrella and said, "You take it. I live close by. Getting wet is nothing." My mother hesitated, but accepted. Later she asked around to return it. That was how they came to know each other. At first my mother didn't think of anything more. In her mind, she was a woman with one failed marriage behind her and a disabled daughter. What could anyone want from her? But Michael didn't see it that way. Everyone has a past, he said. What matters is how we live from now on. He treated me well. Every time he came to visit, he brought cheap snacks and asked about my studies. He listened when I spoke, never showing impatience with my clumsy speech. Instead, he gently corrected me. When Grandma Agnes heard my mother had someone new, she went mad. She's shameless. Agnes screamed everywhere. Already married into our Chu family and now she dares take our granddaughter into another man's house. She threatened to storm their wedding with the entire Chu clan if Hannah remarried. But this time, my mother wasn't afraid. I've suffered enough, she said. I just want a peaceful life with someone I choose. She can say whatever she likes. I can't stop her. My father, David, silent for years, finally spoke up. He went to see my mother and asked, "You really plan to get married?" Hannah replied, "If I hadn't had Lydia, I would have died long ago. I stayed alive for her. Now she's grown. I want to live a little for myself." My father smiled bitterly. "Then I hope you'll be happy," he said. That night, neighbors saw David sitting alone in the yard, drinking until late. My mother's wedding to Michael Liu was simple. No big banquet, no noisy procession. They invited a few close people, shared a plain meal and told heaven and earth they were husband and wife. I was the only one there acting as family. Seeing my mother in new clothes, hair neatly pinned, a touch of pink on her cheeks, she looked a few years younger. Her eyes no longer had the darkness they'd had at the Chu house. The way Michael looked at her wasn't pity, but respect. After the wedding, my mother moved to the county to live with Michael. I stayed in the dorm at school, and on some weekends went to their new home. Their place wasn't big, just a simple dorm room, but it was the first place I truly felt what a home was. The kitchen was tiny, but there was always the smell of hot soup. The table was small, but we sat together and talked about the day. No one shouted, no one smashed things, no one used cruel words as weapons. When Agnes learned Hannah had remarried, her blood pressure shot up and she was hospitalized. "She's unfilial," she cursed. "Already married into the Chu family and still dares take my granddaughter to another man's house. From now on I have no daughter-in-law and no granddaughter." Grandpa Samuel said nothing. The last time I saw him, he studied me for a long time, as if he wanted to speak but only sighed. He handed me a small bag. Inside were a few crumpled bills and an old handkerchief. "I have nothing to give you, Lydia," he said. "I just hope you live well." A few years later he died. We heard the news from villagers. My mother lowered her head, eyes red, but did not go back for the funeral. She knew she'd only be cursed again. Instead, she went to Grandpa Peter's grave and burned incense, as if saying goodbye to both men who had once been her family's pillars. Time went on and I graduated from the special school. Because my grades were decent, I was recommended to a garment factory that hired disabled workers. The job was physically demanding but stable. When I received my first wage, my hands trembled opening the envelope. I brought most of it home to Hannah and Michael, keeping only a little. She accepted it, but didn't beam the way I'd imagined. She simply smoothed my hair. "I don't need you to support me," she said. "It's enough that you can support yourself, Lydia." I still pushed the envelope into her hands. "You worked yourself half crippled because of me," I said. "Now it's my turn to help." She fell quiet, then nodded, eyes shining with tears. At the factory I met many others like me, some deaf, some in wheelchairs, some missing an arm. Each had their own story, but at work we all just focused on our stitches. We talked with our hands, our eyes, our scribbled notes. No one mocked anyone, no one used the word cripple as a weapon. One day a crew came from the city to film a documentary about disabled workers. They interviewed each of us about our lives and dreams. When it was my turn, the interviewer, Daniel, asked, "Do you resent your fate, Lydia?" I thought for a while and shook my head. "If you'd asked me that before, maybe I would have said yes," I answered. "Now I don't. I just feel grateful that even though my ears aren't like other people's, I have a mother and others who never abandoned me." "What's your dream?" Daniel asked. I smiled. "I want a small family of my own," I said. "A peaceful home. Not rich, just a place where no one curses anyone, where no one cries because of cruel words." After filming, they sent us a copy of the video. That night the whole factory crowded into the break room to watch it on an old TV. When my segment came on, everyone fell silent. On screen I looked straight at the camera. My speech was still imperfect, but my eyes were steady. I suddenly realized how much I'd changed. I was no longer the child curled up in a corner, terrified of every glance. I could raise my head and say what I thought. My mother Hannah watched and wiped her eyes. "My girl Lydia really has grown up," she said. Some time later, Michael Lou had an accident at the factory. A machine malfunctioned and he was badly injured. They rushed him to the hospital in critical condition. My mother stayed at his bedside day and night. I took leave from work to help. Those days felt like reliving an old nightmare, this time in a hospital instead of on a mountain. The doctor said Michael might survive, but he'd never be as strong again. He lay on the bed, gaunt. Whenever he saw me walk in, he tried to smile. "How's work?" he'd ask. "Anyone bullying you, Lydia?" I shook my head and said everything was fine. "Good," he'd say. "I can't do much for you, but I want you to live peacefully." Months later he was discharged, but had to give up heavy labor. Money became tight again. My mother Hannah shouldered more of the burden, cleaning, washing dishes in restaurants. Her hands, already rough, grew even more cracked. I urged her to rest and let me handle things, but she said, "If I just sit around all day, I'll go crazy. I'm used to working." For me, working is how I stay sane, Lydia. At an age when many women were already grandmothers, my mother was still quietly doing petty jobs to keep our lives afloat. Neighbors sometimes sighed, "She's suffering because of her fate." Some cruel one said, "She must have sinned in a past life. That's why heaven punishes her now." Their words made me shake with anger. But my mother only laughed. "Let them talk," she said. "It's their mouth, but it's our life. Only we know how we're really living." One day I received a letter from my old school. They invited me back to talk to the younger students about life after graduation. I was nervous. That school was where I had cried and laughed, where I first learned to accept myself. Standing at the podium, I looked down at the young faces, curious and anxious. I told them about my childhood, the night tied to a tree on the mountain, the first time I heard Hannah's voice, my years at school, my work at the factory. "We're different from those outside," I said, "but that doesn't mean we're less. We just have to take a different road to reach the same place." After the talk, a shy girl named Mia came up to me. "Do you hate the people who laughed at you?" she asked. I thought, then shook my head. "Hate is exhausting," I said. "If you have the energy to hate, better use it to live well. When they look back and see you didn't fall, that's your answer." Tears shimmered in Mia's eyes. "I'm scared," she said. "Scared I won't find a job or anyone to love me." "I was scared too," I said, ruffling her hair. "But I learned that loving yourself first is most important. When you value yourself, someone will see that." On the bus back to the county, I stared out the window. I thought of Grandma Agnes, the woman who had wanted to leave me on a mountain. I'd heard that after Grandpa Samuel died, she lived with Uncle Mark Chu, the eldest son. Her health had declined. Some said she regretted her actions, though no one knew if that was true. My mother Hannah kept her decision. She would not go back to the Chu family. "Some doors are better left closed," she said. "Open them and you'll only hurt yourself again." But for me, the Chu family, my grandmother, my father, they were pieces of a puzzle I couldn't erase. One day I got a text from an unknown number. It was my father, David. He'd gotten my number from villagers. "How are you, Lydia?" he wrote. I stared at the screen for a long time. It had been years since he had reached out. "I'm fine," I replied. He texted back, "If you can, come visit your grandmother. She's old." Reading that, I felt a sourness in my chest. I didn't reply right away. That night I told my mother. She was silent for a long while. "If you want to go, I won't stop you," Hannah said. "But don't expect them to have changed." I nodded. A few weeks later, I took a day off and caught a bus to the village. Walking down the dirt road into the hamlet after so many years felt strange, both familiar and foreign. Some old houses were still there, though a few had been rebuilt with red bricks and bright roofs. The Chu house hadn't changed much, only more cracks in the walls. The gate was still the same old wooden one, its paint peeled away. I stepped into the yard, my heart pounding. My grandmother Agnes sat on her old wooden chair, back slightly hunched, hair snow-white. She squinted at me, trying to recognize my face. "Is that you, Lydia?" she asked. I nodded. My father David sat beside her, much older, coughing lightly. "You came," he said. I walked closer and sat down. Agnes looked me up and down, her eyes no longer sharp. "Are you doing well?" she asked. "I'm fine," I answered. She was quiet, then suddenly said, "Back then, I was wrong." The words fell into the yard like a stone. I didn't know how to respond. Memories flooded back, the cold wind on the mountain, the rope biting my skin, Hannah's tears, curses, silent nights. But looking at the frail old woman before me, I saw someone crushed by time. "It's all in the past," I said. She gave a bitter laugh. "For you, maybe," she said. "Not for me. I dream of you every night, standing on the mountain and staring at me without a word. You don't have to forgive me. I just had to say it. I don't care about heaven, I only hope that after I die, I stop having those dreams." I sat still and said nothing. The hatred I'd carried all those years had faded, but not disappeared. It lay at the bottom of my heart like silt in a pond, stirred up whenever a stone dropped in. Before I left, my grandmother grabbed my hand. Her hand was thin and bony, but still warm. "Live well, Lydia," she said. "Don't end up like me." I nodded and walked out. At the gate, my father David ran after me and called my name. I turned. "Thank you for coming," he said. "How are you?" I asked. So, he answered, forcing a smile. "I'm old now, can't do much. Sometimes they ask me to watch a warehouse, earn a bit for medicine." I looked at the deep lines and age spots on his face and hands. Once, he had been the man all the village girls secretly liked. Now he was just a thin old man. "Do you regret it?" I asked. He was quiet for a long time. "What use is regret?" he said at last. "What's done is done. All I can do is try to live decently with what time I have left." I had no answer, so I nodded. As I walked toward the bus stop, I knew there would always be a distance between me and the Chu family, between me and my father. But at least, once, we had faced each other instead of running away. On the bus back to the county, I watched the rice fields swaying, the familiar dirt roads winding away. I thought, I wasn't buried here in the end. My mother Hannah spent her life breaking that circle, and with my own feet I had walked out of it. When I reached the county, Hannah was waiting with a coat in her hands. The air was chilly. She draped it over my shoulders. "Tired, Lydia?" she asked. I shook my head. "I'm fine." She looked into my eyes, as if searching for something. "I saw Grandma," I said. She was silent. After a while she asked, "What did she say?" "She said she was wrong," I replied. My mother gave a small, cold smile. "Too late," she said. She didn't say more. We walked home together. That night, while I was mending a frayed hem, my mother suddenly said, "Daughter, no matter what happens, don't let anyone else decide your life. Not even me. I let others make too many choices for me. I paid for it all my life. I don't want you to repeat that, Lydia." I nodded, feeling a weight lift inside me. In the years after, nothing dramatic happened. I kept working at the factory, helping at home, taking Michael to his checkups. We lived simply, not rich, but not starving. Outside, the world changed fast, new high-rises, wider roads, smartphones and social media everywhere. We kept our slow pace. One day, a new worker came to the factory. He wasn't disabled, just from a poor family and willing to do hard labor for low pay. His name was Ethan Lee. He was quick, cheerful, always helping others. He learned basic sign language to communicate with us. At first I didn't care much. I was used to keeping my distance from men. But little by little, Ethan wore down my defenses with his quiet persistence. He asked about my hearing aid, about what it was like living in a half-silent world. I answered honestly. "You're strong, Lydia," he said. "I'm just used to it," I replied. One lunch break, Ethan handed me a hot steamed bun. "The lady at the stall gave me an extra," he said. "Help me eat it." I knew he'd bought it on purpose, but I accepted it anyway. The bun was warm in my hand, my chest was warmer. We grew closer. He told me about his family, father dead, mother sick, leaving school at 16 to work. I told him about Hannah, about Michael, about my years at the deaf school. He listened, frowning sometimes with emotion, but never with pity. One rainy day, the street outside the factory flooded. I was afraid my hearing aid would get wet, so I huddled under the eaves, hesitant. Ethan ran over, took off his jacket and draped it over my head. "Let me walk you home," he said. I was startled but let him. We waded through murky water, mud splashing our shins. He laughed. "Just like when I was little, catching fish in the fields," he said. My mother opened the door and found us drenched. She fussed over us, handing towels and hot water. Ethan greeted her politely, "I'm Ethan Lee, Lydia's coworker." I happened to be going the same way, so I brought her home. Hannah studied him with a mix of caution and kindness. After he left, she pulled me aside. "Who is that?" she asked. "Just a coworker," I mumbled, blushing. She smiled, saying nothing. But I knew she was thinking further ahead. Eventually, Ethan confessed his feelings. He said he didn't care about my hearing aid or my past. "All I know is that when I'm with you, I feel at peace," he said. I was silent a long time. Old memories rose up, curses, scorn, talk of buying me a husband. "Have you really thought this through?" I asked. "Life with me won't be easy." He nodded. "I know you've suffered," Ethan said. "I can't erase all of it, but I want to share whatever comes next." In his eyes I saw not impulse, but resolve. I remembered Hannah's words, "Don't let anyone else decide your life." I took a deep breath and nodded. Our wedding was small but warm. In the photos, I stand beside Ethan, hair neatly tied, the tiny hearing aid visible on my ear. At first, I wanted to hide it. "It's part of you, Lydia," he said. "Why hide it?" So I didn't. My mother stood below the stage, laughing and crying. Michael sat in the front row, face thin but eyes bright. Grandma Agnes didn't come. David didn't either. I didn't blame them. Who came and who didn't was their choice. For the first time in my life, I felt I was stepping into a new chapter of my own will, not being pushed into one like my mother had been. After the wedding, Ethan and I rented a tiny room near the factory. It had a bed, a wardrobe, a small table and a few plastic chairs. To me, it was more beautiful than any big house, because it was filled with laughter and simple meals cooked with love. I kept working at the garment factory. Ethan worked on construction sites by day and helped at the factory at night. We weren't rich, but we managed. Every month, we sent some money to Hannah and Michael. "Keep it for yourselves," she said. "We can still manage." But I knew they secretly stashed our money away, saving it for when we might need it. Eventually, I became pregnant. I was thrilled and terrified. I was afraid my child would be like me, living in a world half silent. I asked the doctor if my condition was hereditary. "No one can say for sure," he said. "But the chance is low." Even so, I spent the pregnancy on edge. My mother tried to reassure me. "Whatever the child is like, you'll love it," she said. "Like I loved you, Lydia." When I went into labor, I lay on the hospital bed, sweat pouring down my face. They took off my hearing aid so it wouldn't fall and break, plunging me back into silence. All I had were the eyes of the doctors, nurses and Ethan, giving me strength. When the baby cried for the first time, I didn't hear it, but I saw everyone smile. Ethan leaned over, tears in his eyes, and I could read his lips, "She's healthy." They placed the child on my chest. I saw the tiny red face, the fists curled tight, and a wave of emotion I had no words for washed over me. We named her Sophie. A few months later, we took Sophie for a hearing test. While we waited for results, I felt like I was sitting on needles. Every little flinch or startle made my heart clench. When the doctor said her hearing was normal, I collapsed onto the chair as if my legs had turned to water. Tears spilled down my cheeks, tears of relief. I hugged Sophie tight. My daughter grew up between two worlds. One was the world of perfect sound that belonged to her, the other was my world of half sound. I taught Sophie basic sign language, not because she needed it to talk to me, the hearing aid worked, but so she'd know there are many ways to communicate. She loved it. Whenever she wanted something, she would speak and sign at the same time, making everyone laugh. My mother Hannah came to see her granddaughter, never wanting to put her down. "When I look at Sophie," she said, "I feel like I've been given another life." Michael taught her to tap rhythms on the table and cackled every time she missed the beat. Watching them, I felt some of the old pain loosen its grip. One day, while I was folding laundry, Sophie, about 5 at the time, asked, "Mom, why do you wear that thing on your ear?" She pointed at my hearing aid. I stopped, sat beside her and gently said, "Because my ears don't hear as clearly as other people's. I need this to hear better." "Are you sad?" she asked, huge eyes serious. "I used to be," I said. "Not anymore. Because thanks to it, I can hear you call me Mom, Sophie." She thought for a moment, then threw her arms around my neck. "Then I'll call you Mom lots and lots," she said, "so you can hear to your heart's content." I laughed, tears running down my face. In that moment I understood that my old wounds no longer defined me. I wasn't just the child tied to a tree, or the deaf-mute girl people whispered about. I was the mother of Sophie, the daughter of Hannah, the wife of Ethan. Sometimes late at night, when the house is quiet, I lie in bed and take off my hearing aid. The world falls silent again, but it no longer frightens me. It feels like a thick blanket gently covering me, giving me my own private space to think. I think back over my life, the insults, the long nights of Hannah's tears, the dawns she left for the fields, the rushed steps on the road to the county, the hours in front of a mirror practicing speech. Every memory is sharp, painful and beautiful at once. Once I asked my mother, "If you could go back in time, would you choose differently, Mom?" She thought for a long while. "If I chose differently, maybe I'd have suffered less," Hannah said. "But if I chose differently, I wouldn't have you. So I'd probably still choose the same." I hugged her, speechless. Her love for me couldn't be measured in words or tears. It showed in every callus on her hands, every wrinkle on her brow, every time she stood up for me in front of a crowd. When Sophie started kindergarten, her teacher, Ms. Brown, called me in. She told the whole class, "You wear robot ears to hear better," Ms. Brown said. All the kids wanted to see. They didn't laugh, they were fascinated. "Would you mind coming one day and talking to them about it?" I laughed. "I'm not embarrassed," I said. On that day, I stood before a noisy bunch of children and took off my hearing aid to show them. I explained simply, "My ears don't hear clearly, so I need this device." They stared with round eyes and fired off questions. "If you don't wear it, can you hear me say, 'hello'?" one boy asked. "No," I said. He ran up to me, pressed his mouth to my ear and shouted, "Hello." The room erupted in laughter. For a second, I felt a circle close. Once, adults had used my difference to shame me. Now children were using it to learn and be curious. It was a different world, a better one. My mother aged visibly. "I keep dreaming of your grandfather," Hannah told me one day. She meant Grandpa Peter. "He stands in the field and calls me home." "Don't say things like that," I protested. She smiled. "Everyone has to go," Hannah said. "I just hope by the time I leave, you're strong enough that I don't have to worry." "I am strong," I said, gripping her hand. But inside I knew I'd never truly be ready to lose her. A few months later, she fell ill, not just a tumble in the fields or a common cold. Her heart was weak, her lungs failing. She was hospitalized. I quit work and stayed by her side. She lay on the bed, cheeks sunken but eyes bright. "I've had enough life," Hannah said. "I've seen you with a family, someone who loves you, a job. I don't regret anything now." I cried. "Don't talk like that." She smiled. "There are things we can't choose," she said. "But I trust one thing, that you'll live well, Lydia. Do one thing for me. When people ask about me later, don't only tell them the sad parts. Tell them the times I laughed too. I don't want to be remembered only by my tears." I nodded, tears streaming. The night she died, it didn't rain, but the wind howled. I sat by her bed, holding her hand until it went cold. In that moment, it didn't matter whether there was sound or not. The world was equally shattered either way. In the days that followed, I moved through everything like a machine, organizing the funeral, accepting condolences, sorting her things. Sophie was too young to grasp death. "Where did Grandma go?" she asked. "She went to the sky," I said. "She's a star now. A star named Hannah." Every night, Sophie pointed at the sky and asked, "Is that one Grandma?" "Yes," I said. She waved at the star. "Grandma, it's me." My throat tightened each time I watched her. Later, when the sharp pain dulled into a deep ache, I sat down and wrote our story, mine, my mother's, the Chu family's, the village's. I didn't write to complain, but to record. So that when Sophie grows up and asks why her mother became who she is, she'll have an answer. And so that those who once believed a deaf-mute child could only live in darkness might see that light can spring from the most unexpected places. When I was 4, people discovered I couldn't hear or speak. My grandmother Agnes led me up the mountain, tied me to a tree and muttered that a child born deaf and dumb was worthless, that no one would take me, that it was better to throw me away and try again for a grandson. My mother Hannah, who had spent her life bowing her head in submission, suddenly became someone else. She lunged forward, tore me out of their hands, her face streaked with blood and tears. Many years later, as she lay on her hospital bed, I asked, "Why did you dare stand up to the whole Chu family that day, Mom?" She smiled. "Because in my arms," Hannah said, "I was holding my whole world. If I didn't protect you, what would be left of my life?" From birth, I never heard the sounds others called ordinary: birds singing, rain falling, someone calling my name. But I heard other things: my mother's heart hammering when she worried, my grandmother Rose's muffled sigh in the night, my father David's choked sobs behind the wall, the wind hissing through cracks in our walls. Those sounds don't need ears. They take a lifetime to understand. If someone asks whether life is fair, I'll say no. But if they ask whether life is still worth living, I'll say yes. Because layered over all the unfairness are people willing to carry us across the muddiest stretches of road. My mother Hannah was one of those people. And I hope that one day, when Sophie faces her own hardships, she'll remember the blood in her veins comes from people who refuse to bow to fate. That she'll stand tall, lift her head and look the world in the eye. "I didn't come here to beg for your pity," she'll say. "I came to live my own life." My story, my mother Hannah's story, and the stories of countless ordinary yet extraordinary women like her will never make it into history books. That doesn't matter. What matters is that we lived, loved, fought, and guarded what we believed was right. And if somewhere, someday, someone hears this story and finds in it a sliver of courage to face their own life, then all the pain, shame, and tears of those years will have meant something. You've just finished listening to this story on Lumaryn Stories. Thank you for staying till the end. If you've gone through anything similar, I hope you saw a little of yourself here, and understood that you are not alone. May you, no matter how rough your road, keep a soft corner in your heart, to love and to be loved. If you enjoy these stories, please like, share, and subscribe, so I'll have the motivation to bring you the next video soon.